Evening, everybody. It's showtime. Let us just start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, if you don't mind. Would you please stand and join me? There's the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic in which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Our president, Charlie Lloyd, couldn't be here tonight. He's been a little sick, a little ill. He's under the weather, but I talked to him this afternoon. He's on the mend, and with any luck, he'll be here next month. In his stead, of course, our Vice President, Chris Huffman, will do a fine job. Let me just ask you all to do what I'm about to do. Turn off your telephone. There. Are there any first-timers in the house tonight? Don't be shy. Any World War II veterans in the house tonight? Wow. Sign of the times. In any event, I would remind you that at the end of the evening, since we are a nonprofit, we do have a very fine helmet committee who will greet you at the door as you leave and who would accept anything you'd like to donate. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. So, without further ado, where's Chris? Big hand for Chris. Clap, clap, clap. Okay. Chris, by the way, beyond being vice president, he's the guy that finds all of our speakers for the last many months now, and he does a great job and more to come, so keep that in mind for next month. Chris, yours. Thanks.
Let's give also a round of applause to Kirk, our former president here. He deserves it. He was president for many years of our round table. And then Charlie's our current president, of course. I'm the current vice president, and like Kirk says, speaker coordinator and historian. But we also want to thank the World War II veterans that are here. I saw one or two. I talked to one in the hallway out there. So let's give a round of applause for and also all the other veterans as well. Okay, so before I turn to Jared and introduce Jared, I also want to mention who our next month's speaker will be. Veteran, Harold Engel. Some of you might have seen him speak. I saw him speak at Gettysburg before. He had spoke there in a number of other places. He's a veteran of the 28th U.S. Infantry Division, the 28th Division. He fought like around Colmar and some other places, then across the Rhine and everything with the 28th Division. Based right here in Pennsylvania, of course, the 28th Division. He's 99 years old, 99 and a half to be more precise. So, real nice guy, and I think you'll enjoy his presentation next month. September 1st. So let's turn to Jared now. Jared was our first Zoom speaker on Zoom, on computer, online. Many of you might have seen that. I saw it as well. And he spoke about dispatches of D-Day on that one. And a very good book. I actually have a copy of it, a signed copy, so thanks for that. And now he also has written a book called Hang Tough about Dick Winters, who many of you have met before in the past and knew and loved, and I met him before briefly at a Gettysburg event as well, Dick Winters. I treasure the time I met him as well and what we talked about. But now that tonight, Jared will be talking about a book called Fierce Valor. Fierce Valor about Ronald Speirs, who was in with Dick Winters in the same company, Band of Brothers. And now he's kind of a more controversial character, as I think Jared will tell you more about it. And I don't want to spoil all the details, but he'll tell you about some of the things that he was accused of. But he was a brave man, obviously. He fought in combat, but there were a few things that he'll talk about that will also, you might have questions about later on, about some of the more controversial aspects about Ronald Speirs that we'll hear about tonight. Okay, guys, so I'm going to turn over to Jared then, so you can enjoy the presentation. And Jared, thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry, real quick. I also give Jared a shout out because he's earned his bachelor's degree at Penn State, master's at West Virginia University in history. He's now a PhD candidate in American Studies at Penn State Harrisburg. Good school. I taught there for a year or so. So keep it up, Jared. And thanks for coming back again for the second time. Thank you so much. Give a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I must admit that it's a real pleasure to be back in person, seeing people face to face. I taught for about a year on Zoom, and I think we can all agree that this is much better in the broad scheme. The focus, the focal point, the core question of my book that I co-authored with my friend Eric Dorr is a single question. And that single question is, who is Ronald Speirs? And I think this visualization here is perhaps a good way for us to frame our chat going forward. When we think of Ronald Speirs, this is often what first comes to mind. We think of the actor who portrayed him in the HBO series Band of Brothers, wonderfully portrayed by actor Matt. And as a result, as a consequence of this, Speirs' persona, his history, his biography, it has taken on a life of its own. Are we all okay with the mic? Easier. Bear with us here a moment, folks.
Real quick, okay?
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. All right. Splendid. So the big question is, who is this man? And as a result of the HBO series, Speirs has taken on a life of his own. And including in the realm of the internet. So the big question that I'm always asked is, did he kill prisoners of war? The other thing that we can think about, in the realm of celebrity, it's taken on a rather grim celebrity. This is one T-shirt that you can find on a military T-shirt store called Ranger Up, and this one says, Lieutenant Speirs' last stop smoke shop. And then this image up here, it kind of makes a mockery of the book The Lord of the Rings, which of course is a very thick fantasy trilogy. But then this one says, the length of Lord of the Rings if Lieutenant Speirs was the ring bearer, suggesting that the story would be much shorter as a consequence. And so this is the base foundation for us as we're thinking about who this man is, what is he all about. So really the best way to answer this is to go straight back to the beginning. And it begins in Edinburgh, Scotland, April of 1920. Many people do not realize that Ronald Speirs was an immigrant soldier. His parents hailed from Scotland. We can see them pictured here on the screen. Robert and Martha Speirs. Robert Speirs was involved in the armaments industry during the First World War. His mother, Speirs' mother, ran a confection shop. She was a baker. And Speirs was born inside this building on Kerr Street in Edinburgh on April 20th, 1920. Does anybody else know who has a rather notable birthday on April 20th? Adolf Hitler. And so Speirs is born on Adolf Hitler's 31st birthday. Ironically enough, something that his soldiers later pointed out. Eventually, with the onset of the 1920s and the aftermath of World War I coming to an end, Speirs' father sought new vocational opportunities elsewhere, particularly in the United States. In 1923, his father moves to Boston, and the rest of the family, including little Ronald Speirs, joins them in 1924. the image that we see here is, trying a different again? Okay. Third time's a charm. The photograph that we see here on the screen is one of the earliest known photographs of Ronald Speirs, and this was provided to us by his family. And by the time he was a teenager, he found himself enrolled as a student in the building that we see here in the background, known as the English High School. This was his first introduction to military culture. This is where he was first shown in depth the story of the military tradition and American history. And he joined the equivalent of what we would today consider to be a junior ROTC program. His military instructors at the English High School are the two gentlemen who we see here on the right-hand side of the screen, Major Joseph Driscoll, who fought in numerous campaigns on the Western Front, and William H. Meanix, likewise a major, a former Harvard track star who won over 400 medals during his racing days. And Meanix said something that stuck with Speirs. He said, "A man must have speed. Not only physical speed and agility, but also intellectual speed, the ability to think on one's feet and to act promptly, without hesitation." That is something that remained with Speirs throughout the duration of his military career. And later on, we're going to see how he puts that philosophy to very good use. As he ages and grows a little bit older, as he nears graduation age in high school, these two majors likewise encouraged him to enroll in a program, once again, an equivalent of junior ROTC, that was known as National Citizens Military Training Camp. And Speirs thus spent several summers in the wilds of Maine and various military installations in that state as a means of finding himself to an extent. And the photograph that we see here in the upper right shows him in surplus World War I uniform serving in such a capacity. And to my knowledge, that is the first photograph of him that exists in a military uniform. And he was trying to find his way. He was thinking about joining the military, and as he later said, "My first experience with the military was in high school. Close order drill was taught by two regular Army officers. I selected the infantry training because my mathematics was not good enough for artillery, which turned out well for me because to me, the infantry is the soul of the Army." And that is a mantra that he would likewise long stand by. When World War II breaks out, Speirs is not prompt to enlist. In fact, like 60% of Americans who serve in the Second World War, he is actually drafted into the service. He is conscripted. But for him at that time, he was actually enrolled in extension courses. He had studied to be an accountant. He was enrolled in classes, and his local draft board in the Boston area told him that he could finish his extension courses, get an added degree under his belt, and as a result, he would be eligible to enter the United States Army as a second lieutenant. That seemed mighty fine to him. In his earliest months in the United States Army, Speirs served with the 85th Infantry Division at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. But by the summer of 1942, he had learned of a new experimental wing of the United States Army that was referred to as the Airborne. And not only was he an individual who wanted to press himself physically and intellectually, but officers also received an extra $100 per month in, quote, hazardous duty pay for jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, old saying would go. And that motivation ultimately takes him to this hallowed place, Camp Toccoa in Georgia. The daily ritual of which, sometimes multiple times per day, was to do the 6-mile round trip up and down Currahee Mountain. that overlooked this military installation. And by and large, if you could not complete that round trip in about 45 minutes, you were going to be booted out of the division as a consequence. Only about 1 out of every 5 people who attempted to be a paratrooper here ultimately earned their jump wings. And in this moment, we get a really good sense of Speirs' sense of competition. And we're able to get this sort of perspective by firsthand account by one of his fellow paratroopers, a sergeant by the name of Joe Reed. And Joe Reed remembers of one of these excursions up Currahee. He said, on one particular day, Speirs and I had to be running Currahee at the same time. I realized right away that Speirs wanted to race me. I kept looking back, and there he was. I got to the top and quickly proceeded back down the mountain. Speirs was still behind me. I crossed the finish line and felt great. Speirs followed a short time later, coughing and wheezing from his effort to keep up with me. After catching his breath, he gave me a respectful nod of his head and a smile and went on his way. I'll never forget that day. And so this really gives us a glimpse into the competitive spirit, that drive that motivated Speirs throughout much of his years in the service during the Second World War. In September of 1943, the 101st Airborne Division finally crosses the Atlantic and it relocates to England. And over the course of the next several months, these paratroopers, as well as hundreds of thousands of other Allied combatants, will be training, both physically and mentally, for the forthcoming invasion of Europe. And not only is Speirs involved in the cultivation of a new platoon of paratroopers, but this is also where he is going to find his first true love. He meets a young woman who we see here on the left named Margaret Edwina Griffiths. The two of them quickly become smitten, and they arrange to marry. Now, Edwina was a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. That was the female branch of the British Army, and it's the equivalent of Rosie the Riveter in Great Britain. Women who would work spotlights, fix trucks, man radio control towers, and the like. So the two of them were serving in the military at the same time. Life was short. Life had a degree of unexpectancy to it, and they decide to betroth as a consequence. And so, in the little community of Aldbourne, where the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment was bivouacked by and large, they marry on May 21st, 1944. That is just slightly over 2 weeks until June 6th. And so they have a very limited amount of time together. It was a very short honeymoon, but as I said, people were living in the moment. And in the photograph on the right, we can see Speirs here with a big wide grin on his face, kneeling in the upper front with fellow officers from companies within that regiment. There will be a degree of soap opera-like drama to this story a little bit later on, so keep Edwina in mind as we move forward. In more recent and more forthcoming consequences here, it is on, of course, the evening of June 5th, 1944, that the paratroopers once again to prepare to mobilize. They had been told that June 5th was going to be the invasion day, but weather forced them to delay that for 24 hours. At this moment, Speirs was in charge of a platoon of 17 men. And this cluster of paratroopers assigned to a C-47 aircraft was designated as stick number 62. And this plane, among with 3,000 others and along with 13,000 other Allied paratroopers and glidermen, will be making that very daring voyage across the English Channel. And of course, these paratroopers will be helping to pave the way for the amphibious troops that will arrive only 5 or 6 hours after they do. Among the men who are in stick number 62, not only Speirs, who we see depicted here in the middle, But on the left, we see the youngest man in his plane, a tall 19-year-old kid from Ohio, who, because of his height, was known as Jumbo, Art Jumbo DiMarzio. And then we also have the oldest man on the plane, who at 28 years old was definitely an old man in the eyes of many of his contemporaries. And that was a sergeant by the name of Floyd Buddy Corrington. These three men and their fellow comrades in that plane land in Normandy, perhaps about a mile or so north of the contested crossroads of Sainte-Mère-Église, shortly after 1 a.m. on June 6, 1944. These three men land in the same vicinity, in the same pasture, but they are not certain where the rest of their comrades are, and they are by and large left to their own devices and have to start wandering around on their own, trying to work their way to their objective. And it is only a short time after this, as they are working their way up the road, moving toward the coast, that they hear footsteps, they hear voices emanating from the roadway. And they aren't quite certain who, at first, this could be. But then they hear voices, German voices. The three men take cover in a boggy ditch on the side of the road. They are hidden in the shadows. Three unsuspecting Germans come closer and closer. Speirs informs his men not to shoot. The reason why is because they needed intelligence. They needed to find out where they were. And so in a flash, the three paratroopers emerge from the shadows. They grab the Germans' weapons by the barrels, and they disarm all three of them without firing a single shot. A loose line of communication thereafter opens. And this is where we get into the first of many Speirs myths and or controversies. What the paratroopers start to do is they start to hand out cigarettes to these three captured Germans. They start to get that information. But after a few moments, after the anxiety of the moment has subsided, Speirs turns to his two fellow men who we see here on the screen, and he grimly states, "We can't take them with us." This may seem very harsh, perhaps overkill by our standards today, but paratroopers within the 101st Airborne had been given instruction by their division commander, do not take any prisoners in the first 24 hours. Furthermore, there was no place to put them. There was no stockades, there was no military police. These men had an objective to get to, and they would compromise both their mission and their lives if they tried to haul prisoners away with them. And as a consequence, unfortunately, this is where those three Germans meet their fates. And so, in short, yes, Ronald Speirs was responsible for the killing of prisoners of war. But Ronald Speirs was not exceptional in this regard, because what was going on in Normandy was nothing less than a seesaw of violence. It was very much tit for tat in this regard. Americans were killing plenty of prisoners, and the Germans weren't too keen on taking any prisoners themselves. This accounts for one of the bloodiest, wildest, and most desperate nights of fighting in the Second World War. And some of the images that we're going to take a look at here aren't too pleasant to look at, but if we really want to understand what is going on here, it's important for us to take this into comprehension. The background image that we see here is a German Fallschirmjäger troop, a German paratrooper soldier, who has an American bayonet sheath tied onto his belt, one that he presumably took off of a dead or captured American. The Americans thereafter caught up with him, and they killed him with that same knife. You can see it sticking out of his neck in this photograph. And they likewise went through his personal belongings and left one of his photographs on top of his deceased face. Really harsh, grim stuff. At the same time, this photograph that we see on the right indicates to us what American paratroopers are seeing once they land on the ground in Normandy. Their dead comrades littered all over the place, hanging from trees, in the brush, in the vegetation, lumps of flesh laying there that had once been their buddies. When you see something like that, happening to your friends who you've lived and trained with the previous 2 years, you aren't going to be too keen on taking prisoners yourself. There's a die-hard sense of vengeance in the minds of Americans at this given moment. And so, Speirs was not exceptional in this regard. It was a widespread occurrence all throughout D-Day. But the incident gives Speirs this rather ghoulish reputation, one very much embraced in both the book and the miniseries Band of Brothers. And scuttlebutt immediately starts to circulate around the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment that Speirs had this macabre tendency of handing out cigarettes to captured Germans and then executing them accordingly. And this, too, has been depicted more recently in artwork, and you can find all sorts of Speirs merchandise online, which usually invokes the imagery of cigarettes. But the irony here is that Ronald Speirs did not smoke. He probably didn't have any cigarettes on him to be handing out. And so, as the old saying goes, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, because that's what people desire, after all. And perhaps this is a fine example of that. Certainly, though, Speirs' exploits on D-Day are not done. Throughout the day, Speirs and his platoon, as he starts to gather more and more of his misplaced troopers, they're running to the sound of the guns. They're trying to find their battalion headquarters, and ultimately they come across a large contingent of troopers from Dog, Easy, and Fox companies within the 506th Regiment who have been participating in an ongoing firefight at a location known as Braycourt Manor. And at Braycourt Manor, there were 4 105mm German guns that had the lethal capacity to rain down destruction on Utah Beach, which was only about 2 miles away. By this point, the fighting had been ongoing for over 2 hours. In the miniseries, it's condensed down to something like 10 minutes. That it was much more in-depth and elaborate than what we get a sense of. By that point, Lieutenant Dick Winters has already decommissioned 3 of the guns. Speirs arrives on hand with reinforcements, with additional ammo, and he says, "Do you mind if I take a crack at the 4th gun?" And Winters, of course, says, "Be my guest." He was glad to have a breather after being in the fight for so long. And without any hesitation at all, with no restraint, Speirs plunges headlong into the 4th gun emplacement, impervious to all of the fire that is raining down around him. And he essentially takes the 4th gun all by himself to an extent. But the Germans leave him a nasty little surprise in the form of a grenade that they throw in the hole at the last moment. Speirs sees this. It lands right in front of him, and he kicks it out of the trench that he is in, and it blows up mere feet away. And in fact, the blast was so close that it left the forefront of his jump boots smoldering. And one thing that his men remember seeing is that he was standing there in the trench trying to stamp out his foot like it was out of a Looney Tunes cartoon or something like that, because his foot was on fire as a result of the blast. This is one of several incidents in which Speirs expends at least one of his 9 lives. It's amazing that this guy survives the war, and I'll introduce you to some other close calls that he will have as the conflict progresses. The next day, as we get into the early hours of June 7th, 1944, this is where we begin to tackle yet another Speirs controversy. By this point, the paratroopers are several miles inland. They're entrenched in a watery ditch alongside a road leading toward Carentan. It's nighttime out. Perhaps the sun's ready to come up. And one of Speirs' sergeants had grown belligerent. He had liberated some Calvados, some hard French cider. And if any of you ever had Calvados, it can scrape the enamel off your teeth. That's how powerful it is. In short, the sergeant had become intoxicated, and he started to openly defy Speirs. The sergeant wanted to take an attack out across an open pasture. He wanted to go at the Germans. Speirs told him, no, we need to wait for armor to come up from Utah Beach, and we're going to work together to flush out those Germans. Things heat up even further. This heated verbal exchange ensues. The sergeant accuses Speirs of cowardice. Speirs tells the sergeant to return to the rear and sober up. And then the sergeant slowly starts to go for his Thompson submachine gun at his side. And Speirs said, if you reach for that weapon, you better be ready to use it. And unfortunately, that is exactly what the sergeant did. And at the same time, both men raised their Thompson submachine guns, and in an act of self-defense, Speirs killed one of his own sergeants. This is a very rare incident of fratricidal killing in a showdown sort of nature that we see here on the battlefront. This, too, is one of the stories that started to circulate amongst the regiment. But men who were in Speirs' platoon, who were later interviewed, attested to the veracity of all of this. And as Speirs himself wrote to Dick Winters in 1991, he said the platoon saw it all happen without batting an eye. Straight from the horse's mouth. That is yet another Speirs myth that when we look at the historical record actually turns out to be true. Speirs never spoke about any of this with his men because he realized that the reputation that he had formed as a result of these lethal encounters with German prisoners, as well as one of his own sergeants, empowered him. Nobody was going to dare defy him after building a reputation like this. Unfortunately, Speirs' company commander is killed in action the next day, and he never has the opportunity to formally clear his record. But it was very much apparent to all who were present that Speirs was justified, this was an act of self-defense, and even so, officers like him, considering the high attrition rate that officers were going through, he was still needed on the front line and not in the guardhouse awaiting an investigation looking into the matter. It really speaks to the sense of desperation that these paratroopers found themselves in at this given time. Things from there on, though, they aren't going to slow down. And despite some of these darker stories that I just alluded to, there truly is that sense of brotherhood, stemming from the phrase, the band of brothers. And here, too, Speirs speaks about this. And he later writes, why soldiers fight and die as they do seem clear to me. They do it for the small unit, the squad, or the platoon. The infantry soldier is aware of the regiment, the division, or the democracy he belongs to. But his fighting spirit and good morale is caused and nurtured by his buddies, the guys in the foxholes with him. That is the reason men persevere in battle. And it's almost become a cliche to the extent that we've heard it in war films and so on. But in the end, you truly are fighting for the person who is next to you. And that is something that Speirs very much came to the realization of. In the days and weeks that followed, Speirs' family members back in the Boston area also come to realize and recognize his lethality. And it was no secret of how many men were killed by this young lieutenant. This was a clipping that was among Speirs' personal belongings. My co-author has a very large Easy Company collection at the Gettysburg Museum of History, and this is one of the items that was Speirs. And it gives us a really good snapshot of how people in his community perceived him. And the headline here very boldly states, 13 Nazis killed on D-Day by Weymouth paratrooper. And that paratrooper, of course, was Ronald Speirs. The article does not get into distinguishing between how many of those individuals were prisoners of war versus how many of those who were actually killed in combat. But to put ourselves in the shoes of people back then, they really didn't care. A dead Nazi was a dead Nazi, and one more dead Nazi meant a firmer road to victory. And so that sort of splicing of hairs was really not a concern among American readers. This newspaper clipping gives us a good indication of that. Exactly 1 week after D-Day, Speirs and his platoon become involved in another very fierce confrontation, this time at the crossroads community of Carentan. Carentan was absolutely vital for the Allies to capture because without it, they could not properly link the American beachheads of Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. This was one of the most sought-after targets on the Normandy battlefront. And Speirs finds himself in a very desperate situation. And he later on goes to write about 35-page report summing up what he saw and what his platoon experienced on June 13th as the Germans are counterattacking, trying to push the Americans back to the sea. And he wrote, the enemy counterattack had stopped the American regiment in its tracks. At that moment, a heavy mortar and artillery concentration landed in the area. One of the platoon riflemen was struck by this fire and lay moaning on the ground. As I crossed the waist-high wall, I looked back up the hill and saw German soldiers running along the hedgerow we had just left. A shower of grenades was received from the west, where the hedgerow blocked our observation. Now, fortunately for us, the property and the farmhouse that Speirs is speaking of exists to this very day. And through the magic of Google Maps, I've been able to recreate the situation ever so slightly for us. Toward the bottom of the screen, where we see the blue bar, this is where Speirs and his men were positioned on the night of June 12th. They are relocating to the farmhouse, located in the center that has the gray gravel courtyard in it. And as they are relocating, the German counterattack strikes. Largely as Speirs and his men are out in the open, there is a strong chance that they are going to be cut off, if not annihilated, in the process. They therefore take cover behind that waist-high stone wall that Speirs mentioned, and we can see a photograph from the time period showing us a portion of that property. Heavy machine guns on both sides start shooting back and forth at each other. Enemy grenades are throwing into the courtyard in front of a farmhouse that is on fire. Speirs and his men feel like animals who are locked up in a cage. Then come those feared enemy grenades. They blow up in the courtyard. Several of Speirs' men are struck. He himself is struck by some of those fragments that are flying through the air. At this point, his mind and heart are racing. And what he is trying to figure out at this moment is, how do I get my men out of here before we are completely overrun? And at that desperate moment, he sees a small watery ditch emanating from the far end of the courtyard. And where we see the blue arrows stemming off to the upper right, they will use that slight bit of depression in the ground to escape and make their way back to the company line. It's an incredible feat of survival against insurmountable odds when you think about it. But there is a pronounced human cost to all of this. The young man who we see pictured in the lower right is a private from Pennsylvania whose name was John DLC. DLC had likewise been wounded in this fight in the courtyard, and he had been left for dead by Speirs and his comrades. In fact, he was still alive, but they thought that he had perished. The Germans then enter the courtyard. they find DLC laying there, and they commence to bayoneting him as he lay there on the ground. Miraculously, he survives even that. And he starts thereafter, after the Germans are pushed back, he starts to crawl back to his own line, where luckily for him, some medics discover him. He survives incredibly. This was something, though, that ate away at Speirs for the rest of his life. That sense of guilt about leaving a man behind, a wounded man behind, and the psychological toll that had been inflicted on that young private as a result. And even decades later, his fellow veterans attested that every time there was a thunderstorm, DLC would dive under his kitchen table looking for cover, because whenever he heard the thunder, the sound of the guns returned to his mind. And so it's an important reminder that the casualties of war, it's not merely physical wounds, but it's also psychological wounds of what men see and what they go through. And the story of John DLC is a very profound point in that regard. Once we get into the later summer, and looks like my remote's not working. Can you advance the slide for me? Thank you. We'll try it again here in a moment. The division gets about 2 months rest in England. They are pulled off the line in July 1944. But they will soon be mobilized once again after some rest and recuperation in England. And on September 17th, 1944, the 101st Airborne Division, along with several other Allied airborne divisions, will be dropping into Nazi-occupied Holland in the ill-fated operation that is codenamed Market Garden. This is an instance where hubris and a sense of over-optimism got the best of Allied planners. The chief aim was to capture a number of key bridges spanning the Rhine River and nearby rivers, and in the process try to batter a door into the heart of Nazi Germany and bring a conclusion to the conflict by Christmas of 1944. It was an operation that was completely dependent upon timing and logistics, both of which dreadfully fell apart as the campaign progressed. By this point, Speirs had been promoted to the role of an intelligence officer for battalion headquarters. And at first glance, one might think that that would spare him from frontline combat. He's serving more so in a staff capacity at this given time. But if you were to think that, then you don't know Ronald Speirs, because we're going to find out what happens next here. And this is a lengthy quote, and I'll read it because I realize it might be a little bit hard to read, but some things are worth reading in their entirety. After the initial failure of Market Garden, the fighting started to stagnate, and it turned into a sense of stalemate into October and November of 1944 as the weather was growing colder and more miserable as a result. And so what Speirs thought, he's like, well, if I want to get intelligence, the best way to get intelligence is if I go out and get it myself. Yeah, and then the information won't get garbled in transmission or anything like that. And so, this is his commendation that would coincide with him receiving the Silver Star for actions in October 1944. And I would dare to say that not even the most audacious Hollywood screenwriter could come up with something as outlandish as what I'm about to read you. It says, on 10 October 1944, in the vicinity of Randwick, Holland, he, Speirs, was assigned the mission of leading a patrol to the bank of the Nieder-Rhine River to determine enemy activity across the river. He reached the riverbank with his patrol in the early hours of the morning and spent the entire day observing across the river. After dark, he voluntarily swam to the opposite bank alone, where he found himself in unknown enemy territory. He located an enemy machine gun nest, an enemy headquarters, and other enemy activity near the town of Wageningen. He secured a rubber boat left by the enemy and returned to the friendly side of the river with this information. While returning to his own lines, he was wounded by fire from an enemy machine gun. Lieutenant Speirs was the first to cross the Niederrhein River in this vicinity, and in so doing, he paved the way for other patrols to make similar reconnaissance. So, this guy swims the Rhine River by himself. And just to give you a sense of scale and perspective, that's like swimming across the Susquehanna River. It's a very daring feat in and of himself, and he arrives on the shore waterlogged. He obtains information about the enemy, and as he is rowing back in a stolen rubber boat, he gets wounded in the buttocks and the hip going back. He gets the $1 million wound, as the old saying goes. But not even that would keep him away from his regiment. And this action would earn him the Silver Star as a result. He spends roughly the next 2 months recuperating, and he arrives back in mid-December 1944 in Reims, France, where the 101st Airborne Division is headquartered. What else is about to brew here in mid-December of 1944? The Battle of the Bulge. And so his timing is impeccable in this regard. It's almost like they planned it that way. There are many famous instances and acts of heroism on Speirs' part as he is participating in the Battle of the Bulge, also known as the Ardennes Campaign. Bastogne, of course, this other vital crossroads town in Belgium, thereafter becomes synonymous with the heroics of the 101st Airborne Division. But perhaps Speirs' supreme moment of gallantry comes a few weeks later on January 13th, 1945, as the division is moving beyond Bastogne, pushing northward, capturing these various Belgian communities in domino fashion, and up next, his regiment sets its sights on the town of Foy. In the morning hours of that day, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was sent in an all-out assault on the town. Several dozen yards of open white pasture separating the tree line where they were in their position and the town itself, which is heavily defended by German occupiers. Then, as Battalion Commander Dick Winters is standing back by the tree line, he notices that the assault grinds to a halt. And he immediately becomes infuriated about what is going on. And here's where accounts differ a little bit as to why the attack stalled. One theory is that the newer Easy Company commander, a young lieutenant by the name of Norman Dyke, has cracked under pressure, that he has frozen with indecision, doesn't know what to do, and he freezes up as a result. Other accounts, though, including by men in Easy Company, claim that Dyke was actually wounded during the assault on Foy, for which he's certainly granted a little bit more sympathy. In any case, Winters is not entirely certain what is going on. He prepares to run out there himself, and then he stops himself dead in his tracks. And he says, no, you can't let your sentimentality for Easy Company get the best of you. You command the battalion now. And he kind of grudgingly pulls himself back from running into the melee. And at that moment, he turns to his left, and he says, there I saw Ronald Speirs, a natural killer. I don't know why he was there. I don't know why he was standing in that spot, but he was just the person I needed to be standing there in that moment. Winters yells out, Speirs, take that attack on into town. Relieve Dyke. Get those men moving. And without saying a word or batting an eye, Speirs darts right into the attack. He runs out to all of the non-commissioned officers around the incapacitated Norman Dyke. He says, this platoon, go that direction. Heavy weapons platoon, go that direction. It was like, a hot knife going through butter, how smoothly he was running the show here. And it was during all of this as the attack is pushing into town that Speirs recognizes a potential danger. There was a sister company, I Company, moving in on the right beside Easy Company. And Speirs was concerned that I Company would start shooting in to Easy Company, that this could result in a friendly fire incident. And this is when he temporarily departs Easy Company and essentially runs through the German lines in order to connect with Americans who are on the other edge of town. And Germans and Americans alike were dumbfounded by what they saw in this given moment. And Speirs himself reflected on this, and he wrote, "I remember the terrain outside Foy, broad open fields where any movement brought fire. A German 88 artillery piece was fired at me when I crossed the open area alone. That impressed me." Suffice it to say, indeed, most assuredly, they would impress me too. But in so doing, he reconnects with I Company. He tells them to hold their fire, keep pushing into town, and moments after he departs them and starts running back, the lieutenant from that company who he had conversed with, named Roger Tinsley, was shot through the head and chest and mortally wounded. Had Speirs stayed put there for another 10 seconds, he too would have been killed by that volley of fire. And so this is where we can scratch another tally mark here and get a sense of, he's expended a few more of those 9 lives here outside of Foy. But it's on this day and through the rest of the war and beyond that Speirs formally becomes the commander of Easy Company. And he will be the longest serving commander of Easy Company, close to a year in total. Longer than Dick Winters, longer than Herbert Sobel, longer than Norman Dyke or Moose Heiliger. He was the longest serving one, but it was at the tail end of the war. And he certainly gained the respect, even if many of his men were fearful of him. He certainly gained their respect that day. They were willing to put aside all the controversies and the stories because he was where he needed to be when they needed him most, and they realized it. As we get into April and May of 1945, the 101st Airborne Division has the good fortune of being advancing into the vicinity of Berchtesgaden, which is in the shadow of the Alps and which was the symbolic home of Nazism. And the 101st Airborne, specifically the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, were among the first Allied troops to occupy that town. Not quite the first, as they're seen in the miniseries, but one of the first. And they nonetheless enjoy the luxuries of the Eagle's Nest, the Kelstein House, Hitler's Alpine retreat high up in the mountains. And here's a fantastic photo of some paratroopers with their shiny jump boots up on Hitler's windowsill, enjoying the scenery. The photograph that we see here on the left, or the right, excuse me, is Sergeant Talbert, Floyd Talbert, who is standing on the hood of one of Hermann Goering's luxury limousines, one of his convertibles. And the story here is that the automobile was bulletproof, and paratroopers being paratroopers, they decided, well, there's only one way to find out if it's bulletproof. So they got some armor-piercing rounds and shot it full of holes, and it ended up looking like Swiss cheese, and they thought, well, it wasn't bulletproof after all. So a good scientific experiment here going onward. Speirs was able to confiscate one automobile much like that likewise belonged to Hermann Goering, and he decided to take it joyriding. And at this moment, one of his superiors, Colonel Robert Strayer, who we see here on the bottom, decides to pull rank. And he walks up to Speirs sitting in the driver's seat, and he says, "Okay, Speirs, hand over the keys." And Speirs says, "No can do, sir. Possession is 9/10 of the law." And then he drives off and leaves his colonel standing there in the dust. And just to add an exclamation point onto his declaration, he decides that he doesn't want the colonel to have the car at all. And so he drives it to the nearest cliff, puts it in neutral, and pushes it over the side. And suffice it to say, Colonel Strayer never got his joyride in Hermann Goering's limousine. The photograph that we see here in the background is a very famous photograph of Easy Company, taken in the immediate aftermath of the war. Once again, the Alps in the background. And Speirs is right here in the middle. He's surrounded by his so-called band of brothers. And sadly, just of the past month, the very last member of Easy Company passed away. And that gentleman was this individual right here holding up the flap of the company guidon. His name was Bradford Freeman. And so every man in this photograph is now gone, and it certainly underscores this idea of a generation quickly fading into memory as a consequence. Bradford Freeman wrote the foreword for our previous book about Dick Winters, and we're really honored that he was able to do that. So, likewise, as the war wraps up and as we get into the year 1946, late 1945, the 101st Division, specifically the 506th Regiment, determines that the best way to commemorate some of their achievements is to publish an album, a scrapbook of sorts, that they will fittingly entitle Currahee. And one of the pages within this yearbook shows all of the company commanders of the regiment at the end of the war. And so pretty much everybody on this page is shown looking like $1 million. They're in their Class A uniforms, they're in their ties and their garrison caps. But if we see Speirs, he doesn't quite blend in with all the rest of them. He's in a yellow box here in the middle aisle, the middle row. And while everybody else is all spit and polish, Speirs is standing there with his Thompson submachine gun in hand, grenades clipped to his suspenders, and captured German binoculars around his neck. It's like his comrades were trying to subtly tell us something. Like, people will be looking at this book for years to come. Who was the fiercest of all of us? Well, the image chosen here is a pretty good indicator of what his fellow troopers thought of him at this stage of the conflict. Unlike most paratroopers who served in that regiment, Speirs decided to pursue a long-term military career. Serves in both the 101st, the 82nd Division, and then by the time we get to the Korean War, he serves in the 387th Regimental Combat Team. And in Korea, he conducts 2 more combat jumps. And so when it's all said and done, by the time he retires, he has jumped into combat 4 times. And there's not many American soldiers who can make a claim as such. And so these 2 photographs here on the left, including this one in the combat zone showing him in an entrenched position in Korea, speaks to the additional campaigns that he served in. Later on in his career, as we get into the mid-1950s, he served in a number of staff jobs in the 1st Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, and a number of other positions in the Cold War military. But he is certainly not done yet, because he will relocate to divided Berlin in 1956, serves as a liaison officer of sorts, and then in 1957, he becomes the commandant, one of the Allied governors of Spandau Prison. And Spandau Prison was a big old brick castle-like prison from the late 19th century where the Third Reich had imprisoned political prisoners. And now the tables had turned, and some of the key masterminds of the Holocaust were being imprisoned here and guarded in turn, in rotation, by the 4 Allied powers that looked over Berlin. And so, the Americans did it for 3 months, and the Russians did it for 3 months, and that is how they operated this prison. And in the course of that time, Speirs became one of the commandants, and here we see him interacting with members of the press outside of the prison walls. And there's a degree of irony in all of this, that there are war prisoners being guarded inside who are purportedly being guarded by, as some were concerned, a war prisoner up in the guard tower here. But all indicators suggest that Speirs was a model warden, ran a really tight ship, and he received additional commendation for this role in 1957 Berlin. Into 1961, he serves in a semi-secret capacity for a new mission, which is codenamed Operation White Star. And what he was doing in this regard is that at this time, the country of Laos in Southeast Asia, kind of as a predecessor to the Vietnam War, was engaged in a civil war between kind of the democratic communism sort of formula that many conflicts of that time were. And Speirs' responsibility was to set up a OCS school, an officer candidate school, to train and prepare low-Asian officers for their various commitments in this conflict. And in this photograph right here, we can see him handing out commissions at a graduation ceremony circa 1961. His very last posting will be in the Pentagon itself, and he arrives at the Pentagon in early October 1962. And in the following week is when the Cuban Missile Crisis commences. And so Speirs is working in the Pentagon on civil defense matters as this threat of nuclear proliferation unfolds. And for this reason, I often refer to Speirs as kind of like the Forrest Gump of 20th century military history, because he's everywhere. He's meeting everybody. He's seeing everything. World War II, Korea, the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so much more. And so he remains here for about 2 years, and in March of 1964, he officially hangs up his hat, hangs up his uniform, and he retires. Or did he? All right, kind of the cliffhanger here. Because I found his name in a 1965 State Department directory that shows him working for the Department of State in Saigon, in South Vietnam. Now, was he really serving in some sort of civilian diplomatic capacity? I highly doubt it, because it's well known that many officers, veterans of the 101st Airborne Division in the Second World War, later joined the Central Intelligence Agency and other clandestine organizations and played key roles in some of these developing countries throughout the 1950s and even into the 1970s. And this suspicion is further confirmed in my mind because the person who was running the American embassy in Saigon was Speirs' former boss, the former commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Maxwell Taylor, who was the ambassador to that country at this time. So I could see Maxwell Taylor calling up Speirs and saying, "Speirs, I need you again." We tried to obtain additional information on the background of all of this, and we were told that information is classified. And so that was as good a confirmation as any. Like, well, you practically confirmed it for us there if it's still classified. But in any case, he was probably still working in some sort of military or clandestine capacity into 1965 or 1966. After that, he formally retires. He moves to Southern California. Sometime in his spare time, he goes panning for gold in Southern California and northern Mexico. And this leads us to a really important question about Ronald Speirs, and that is, what sort of dog do you think Ronald Speirs owned, given his reputation and his ferocity? What do you think? A Doberman, Dachshund, a pit bull. Well, unfortunately, this graphic is not working here on our screen, but in actuality, I won't keep you in suspense, it is a poodle. Now, here's the rub. If you want to see the photo, you're going to have to buy the book, though, I guess. It's, yeah. The graphics weren't working here, so we only have the image. So, but I'm not lying. I'll show it to you after the presentation. So, yeah, maybe he did have a soft and fluffy side, after all. I don't know, perhaps. This is where we circle back to his romantic life. Because if there wasn't enough drama in his life, there's added drama in the fact that he was married 5 times. Now, the story of his first wife, the one that he married about 2 weeks before D-Day, is the most dramatic of all of them. Because the war in Europe ends, and as it does, a man returns back and wants to reconnect with Edwina. And as it turns out, that man was her former beau who had been missing since 1941. He had been fighting in Libya with the British Army. He had been captured, and then he spent the next 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp, and everybody at home thought that he was dead. And then in the summer of 1945, he comes back home and says, "I'm alive." Talk about a tough decision, because now Edwina has to choose between the man who she was first in love with and she thought was dead, and her American husband, who wants to stay in the military and wants to take her back to the United States. And ultimately, she decides to stay with her British love interest, and she and Speirs divorce as a result. And so, as all these other paratroopers are going home, it's very celebratory. People are looking to the future, and Speirs' journey home is rather forlorn and sad by comparison. But he goes through a slew of other wives up through the 1980s. And as we interviewed his family members, all of them have incredibly warm, thoughtful, tender thoughts of him. They said he was a gentleman, he was chivalrous, he was quiet, he was dignified. And I dared to ask the question, well, how do you reconcile all of that with the fact that he had 5 wives? And his grandson summed it up perfectly, and he said Grandpa was married to the Army. That was the best way he could put it. And I thought that makes perfect sense, because when you're gone for a year or two, these extended deployments, serving in an officer capacity, that can wreak havoc on one's domestic life. And accordingly, when Speirs marries for the final time in the mid-1980s to a woman by the name of Elsie, that marriage is the longest and happiest of his life, and he's married to her for over 20 years. Why? Because he was retired. Because he was no longer in the Army. He was no longer in the military. He no longer had that obligation. He could give the attention that was necessary to his wife and home front life. And so I thought, well, that makes sense. That makes sense. That, too, is another cost of military service that is often overlooked. Once we get into the 1990s and the 2000s, and we'll start to wrap things up here shortly, fame comes knocking at his door, unwanted fame and celebrity. The book Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose comes out in 1992. Speirs is very hesitant to do an interview with Stephen Ambrose. Speirs is concerned that some of those stories about him, some of the rumors about him, are going to resurface. He was fearful that Nazi skinheads were going to come after him, as he attested in some of his letters to Dick Winters. He thought that Germans would try to assassinate him for what he did to some of their countrymen. And likewise, when the producers of HBO, of the series, asked to record him and include him in some of those sessions in little vignettes that you see at the beginning of each episode as the veterans are sharing their stories, he refused to do that. This was a guy who, when he retired, he threw away all of his uniforms. He only went to one reunion, and that was in 1947. No one had seen or heard of him since in person. He wanted to put his military life behind him. Perhaps it was too painful. Perhaps it was too scandalous. And, bless you. And Richard Winters kept on begging him. He's like, the men want to see you, and you have to be involved in this story. And you were the longest-serving company commander. How can we tell this story without you being involved? And in 2000, Speirs wrote again to Winters, and he said, "Here we go again. Will this never end? I am just not interested. Let someone else be the hero. Dick, you have other guys who can do this. Get this job to one of our other people. You know I was never keen on this in the first place. At 80 years old, I have no desire for camera, lights, action." This is a guy who just wants to be left alone. And as a result, he becomes all the more mysterious as a consequence. He inadvertently adds to the very thing that he's trying to avoid by not speaking and not wanting to get involved with all of it. So they film A Band of Brothers throughout 2000, and it's slated for release in September of 2001. And the June prior to that, June of 2001, HBO decides that it's going to have a grand debut at the edge of Omaha Beach. They're going to invite all the surviving members of Easy Company, all of the actors, the French military and the U.S. Army are going to be there. There's going to be a huge festive atmosphere. And once again, Speirs was invited to attend. Winters desperately begged him. He's like, "This may be the last chance that you have to see any of us. Do this for us." And Speirs says, "I can't do it." But his wife Elsie says, "Well, if you don't go, I'm going to go." And as a result, he ends up going. And this is the first time since 1945 that Speirs and Winters saw each other in person. They had spoken over the phone, they had written to one another, but as far as seeing one another in the flesh, this was the first and the last time since the Second World War that they would be able to greet each other in person. And here they are with their wives on either side, getting ready for the grand premiere of Band of Brothers. And it's very fitting in some ways because here they are almost 60 years later, and they're still guarding each other's flanks. You know, something that they recognized and wrote about in their later correspondence. In the following years, as we get into the final years of Ronald Speirs, he started to suffer from Alzheimer's. Began to lose his strength, began to lose his memory, couldn't recognize all of his loved ones, all of his family members, and his grandson, who we interviewed in depth, said that this was really difficult to see, watching him wage his final battle, as they phrased it, because he had always been so strong, so independent, full of vitality, and watching him wither away to nothing, both physically and mentally, was exceedingly difficult for the family to watch. Before Speirs passes away in April of 2007, he made a final request of his family members. He wanted to be cremated, and after he was cremated, he wanted his ashes spread in a scenic mountain lake. At this time, the family resided in Montana, and a few months after Ron passed away, one of his family members drove 10 hours to this location, Big Theriault Lake, which is only a few miles away from the Canadian border. And it is such a peaceful-looking place. It has physical resemblance to Easy Company's final outposting in Austria. These mere smooth waters, very peaceful environment. And as I thought about this, and as I looked at photos of the lake, I began to think, perhaps at last, Ronald Speirs has the peace and the serenity that he had long desired, but had also long evaded him while he was actually alive. And these are the interesting things that we can think about as we ponder the legacy of this mysterious, enigmatic man by the name of Ronald Speirs. Thank you for coming to my lecture this evening. Shall we do questions? Is that typical part of the forum?
Yes.
Okay.
Answer period, and I'll take the mic around for any people that have questions in the
Very good.
audience. Just real quick, we have a board member, Patty, wanted me to mention that August 16th is National Paratrooper Day. Airborne Day. I didn't know myself, so thank you for correcting. So any questions, please put your hands up, and I will come around. Thank you. Okay.
He retired a lieutenant colonel.
Who else would like to? Oh, yes.
This is not directly a Speirs question, but you said that Winters was the battalion commander when they were attacking Foy. In the series, he's the executive officer. So can you clarify that?
You're correct. I misspoke. He was the XO at the time. There are a few up in the front here, too.
You have a question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see you back there. We'll get to you.
Up here first?
I sort of entered a little bit late this evening, and I don't know a whole lot about you. So I was curious if you would just maybe reiterate why this particular individual, why are you passionate about this individual, what brought you to Speirs?
This book is really a sequel of sorts to my previous book. My co-author and I, Eric Dorr, looked into the life of Dick Winters and his wartime correspondence, and in the interim, my co-author, who's a major collector of Easy Company artifacts, was able to procure many of Ronald Speirs' documents and personal items. Oh, now it's getting really mysterious. Okay. And so it seemed a natural fit. We examined this one person, and now we can examine this other. And we felt that we had enough materials to assemble a biography. And there'd never been a biography written about him, despite the fact that he's one of the more mysterious and characters from Band of Brothers, and people always have questions about him. And so ultimately, this book is our answer to all of the questions that were lingering about his service, in a nutshell.
How many children did he have, and I guess grandchildren then?
Yeah, that's where things get a little bit complicated. His family tree is a tangled web for any genealogist. He does have a son who is still alive. And his son assumed the name of his stepfather, the British prisoner of war, who came home after the war. He himself served in the British military with distinction, and so he has followed in both of his father's footsteps in that regard. It's possible that he may have had another child along the way, but the details of which were so uncertain to the extent that we did not feel comfortable elaborating on that or speculating of that in print. So one, possibly two children.
Can you tell us more about the high school he attended in Boston?
Mm-hmm.
Was it a public school, government-run school, but after the theme of a military academy or art, like pre-ROTC program school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the English high school is actually the oldest public high school in the United States. I believe it was established sometime around 1820, and so him going to school there, the teachers who had taught there, the students who had gone there had served in every American war. And that was a tradition that was very much apparent when he walked through the hallowed hallways of that institution. It was also a very diverse school, at a time when many public schools were segregated. There were Mexican Americans and African Americans and people from Poland and Eastern Europe and immigrants like himself who went to school there. And it was really sort of a blueprint for the integrated army that Speirs would see, 20 years later in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And so not only was he exposed to military culture, but he was exposed to the diversity that is the United States. And I think that fed into his idea of what democracy is all about. And so I think understanding his school and the people that he met and the history and culture that he was exposed to there is absolutely foundational to understanding him as an officer. Mm-hmm. Great question. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you have any studies about some of the enlisted men, particularly the NCOs that served under him or in the 506.
Like book recommendations?
Well, as a matter of fact, a former company commander of mine was an EM in the 506. And at Foy, he was also awarded the Silver Star by General Taylor. I have a picture of that.
Oh, wow.
A hell of a good guy. And he stood only about this tall. He claims he had to stand on his tiptoes to get into jump school.
Uh-huh.
After the war, he returned to his town in Missouri, which is a dirt poor town. He couldn't get a job, decided to go back into the service. They said, with your career and your accomplishments, we think you could be a leader, and they put him through the officer candidate system that they had going then. It was a fairly fast program. And he served in many airborne companies, including mine, which was a little long-range reconnaissance patrol company in Europe. As a major, he was company commander. He went on to retire as a full colonel. Not bad for an old enlisted man. He was a neat guy, and by coincidence, he lived about 15 miles from here. So I had the opportunity, when I came back and moved to Harrisburg, I realized he was here, so I wanted to go see him. Because we had a couple of incidents together, one of which our parachutes collided in midair, and he rode along with me, and I made sure he was on the bottom when we landed. And he remembered that, but not by name. But once we got to talking to him, I says, "You."
Yeah.
He says, "That was a great landing, good move." But long story is, he died a few years ago. Unfortunately, he'd have loved to have heard your presentation, and I'm sure he could have added a lot to it. But I wrote an article for Patrolling Magazine, the 75th Ranger Regiment. If you'd like a copy of it, I'd be happy to send it to you, just because some of these guys were pretty incredible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise an excellent point because so many of them became these really stalwart non-commissioned officers and officers into the 1950s and the 1960s. And you offer a really good personalized example there in that regard. As to, if you're interested in learning more of the enlisted men of this company, there's a wide array of books. And I would recommend some of the books of author Marcus Brotherton, who's written 3 or 4 books on the so-called Band of Brothers. And so that's a good start.
Great.
Thank you.
I'll get your notes. I'll send it to you. You might be interested in it or not.
Absolutely. I would love to see it. Thank you.
That-
Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, how did he attribute or acknowledge his survival? And that was something that he questioned time and time again in his written correspondence with Dick Winters, and it's something that many veterans have often asked themselves, why them and not me? He wrote that on at least a few occasions in his correspondence. Speirs was not an overtly religious man. On his dog tag, a picture of which we have in the book, his denomination was marked as Congregationalist. As far as we could tell from family members, he was not a frequent churchgoer, but he had some sort of religious tendency. It was not zealous, it was not overt, but as the old saying goes, there's no atheists in foxholes. And his family surmised the same of him. That's the best way I can answer that on a religious or spiritual point of view. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was our methodology and research and our timeline. This was a pandemic project. I was teaching classes online. My colleague's museum was closed for a time. And it was a really good project when you're in isolation. The one challenge that we encountered is that the National Archives was closed, and we needed access to after-action reports and morning reports and things along those lines. And that is where our dedicated crew of fellow historians stepped up and helped us out in a really big way. And they were like, oh, you need this report? Oh, I have that on file. I'll make it a PDF and email it to you. And so a lot of our research, we had to go about it in a roundabout way, and we really had to pull from a community of historians who were well-versed in all of this, had done a lot of the research. And foremost among them, I have to give him credit, is historian Mark Bando, who in the 1960s, when he was a young man, started going to 101st Airborne Division reunions and started interviewing these guys long before anybody else was doing it. Including several interviews with Speirs' platoon members from the 1980s through the 2000s. And so, you know, as the old saying goes, it takes a community, and that's what we relied upon in some instances. A lot of other primary source documents are located in the Gettysburg Museum of History as part of the broader Band of Brothers collection that my co-author owns and curates. It only took us about a year to put the book together. I'm a quick writer, and when I have the source material in front of me, I can assemble it in a fairly rapid fashion, but I'm sure someday it'll get the best of me. Yeah, it's technically his step-great-grandson who lived with Speirs for a time in his final years. He lives in Montana with the extended family of Elsie's, his final wife. And so we interviewed him and his dad and his uncle. And then there are many of Speirs' nieces and nephews from the Boston area who are now scattered all throughout the country, who we likewise interviewed, and they provided really invaluable insight on genealogy, family photographs, personal insights and quirks and eccentricities that he had that we were able to incorporate into the book. And so it was a very organic book in how we researched it. And our work was built on the shoulders of many other people who were willing to help us out and share some resources. All right. If there are any other questions, we can adjourn out into the hallway, and you can ask in person. I do have some of my books for sale, but thank you once again for coming out to the lecture. I really appreciate it and had a good time.
Hello? Can you hear?
Jared, do you have time for one more question? Do you have time for one more question?
Oh, yeah, sure. One more question.
Sorry
Go
to
ahead.
interrupt.
Sorry, real quick. I heard that Dick Winters himself spoke at this actual roundtable.
Correct.
At its inception. Is that true?
Yes, from what I've been told. I wasn't here for it, but I was told so.
Okay, I just thought that was pretty cool. All right, thank you.
Uh-huh, you bet.
Jared, thanks so much for your presentation. We'll probably be sending you, Jared's a two-time speaker, so we'll probably be sending you, you already have the coffee mug, right? And we have a coaster I think we'll be sending you to go with it, yeah. And Jared's going to be outside for book signings and book sales and book signings in the back here, in the narthex. Thank you.